To start, let me give just a bit of background for context. I'm female, age 20, attending a university in a city about 45 minutes away from my suburban town, and I commute back and forth by train. Also been happily taken for 5 years now. Back in February, I was doing as I always did 3 days a week, around 2:30 in the afternoon, waiting at the station for the train. I walked up to the platform, out of breath from climbing 50-odd steps to get up there, and stood over by one of those free-standing platform advertisements, and leaned up against it to rest. There was some larger guy, looking not too much older than myself, wearing a long black peacoat and dark pants standing nearby, but I didn't take much note. Suddenly, he smashes his arm, up against the billboard as if he fell into it. I glanced over at him and he immediately said, "Sorry," in a surprisingly light, creepy Michael Jackson-sounding voice. For a guy his size, he was roughly 200 pounds and about 5'7", 5'8". Something seemed peculiar about that action that he just did on the advertisement. It almost looked like he intentionally banged into the billboard to get my attention. It looked pretty stupid out of my peripheral vision and didn't sit right with me. That segued into us chatting while waiting for the train. Bear in mind that this entire interaction happened in only a span of 5 minutes, because I make sure I walk myself to the train with only little time to spare, so I'm not just hanging around at the station after school. The area doesn't have the best reputation for safety and low crime. Anyways, so this guy bothered me right off the bat, but I couldn't quite put a finger on what about him that I didn't like just yet. I like to give people a chance before I form solid opinions on them. I figured maybe I'll make a friend at the train, so I'm not always by myself. So the train arrives shortly after, and I get on with him following closely behind me. Not anything abnormal when the train arrives. Everyone piles on top of each other to board the train. There weren't any empty seats for the both of us, so I sat next to someone else. He sat right behind me with someone else as well. I kept my head down at my phone and played some games and listened to music like I normally do, and I was content. I didn't want to be bothered with keeping myself spun around in my seat the whole ride to talk to him. Even when the train emptied out, we're the last stop, he kept sitting where he was. When we arrived, I got up, pulled out my headphones, and he says, "Candy Crush." So I happily nod and tell him that I'm addicted to playing it, etc., etc. Normal chatter, but a bit unnerving that he was peering over the seats to look at what I was doing. Not too abnormal though, I guess. So we get off the train and walk back to wherever each of us parked. We're chatting and he says, "So I see you go to school on Mondays, Wednesdays and Fridays. I always see you at the station in the morning and afternoon." I thought, weird. Never once during our interaction so far have I told him that I went to school on those specific days. Hell, I didn't even tell him I went to school. Some people at that station don't necessarily attend my school, even though the station is right by campus. So I said, "Yeah, I do." Still lighthearted because I figured, well, it can't be that hard to deduct that I'm a student, with my backpack and casual clothes and all. Also, I wasn't as creeped out by him knowing the days I went to school, until I thought back on it later. When we got to a row of cars in the parking lot, I said something like, "Well, here's where I parked. It was nice meeting you." And he replies, "Wait, I parked there too." So we walked together, and now it was a bit awkward since I expected to part ways. And then I get to my car. He gets to his. His car is right next to mine. What are the chances? It's a rather large parking lot for a train station as well. He was in an old red Monte Carlo, and he bragged about it to me. I acted impressed when I really didn't care much for the car. Now I gave him a goodbye, and he gave me a look like he expected a hug, even though we had just met. I just stuck out my hand, shook his, and went on my way. Next day comes. I believe it was a Friday after meeting him on a Wednesday. This time I managed to grab a seat with him on the train coming home from school. We conversed, and the entire conversation felt so forced. I wasn't enjoying anything he was saying, but I forced myself to agree anyway. He talked about how he's the life of the party when he plays blues on the guitar. Must be some exciting parties. And how he works at McDonald's. Not sure if that's something to brag about, but he bragged about it. Anyways, he was definitely trying to impress me throughout the conversation. The eye contact was odd too. I glanced away quickly, and he just kept on staring at me. Who knows what he was thinking? I wasn't happy at all how I felt after that conversation. I can't be friends with someone if I don't enjoy talking to them. So I got up, walked off the train with him yet again. We walked back to our cars, parked right next to each other. By now I was weirded out. Is this guy really watching me? It sure felt that way. This time before parking, he asked for my number. There's the question. I said nicely, how about Facebook? Do you have that? I can add you there. Pretty smooth. I was hoping he'd get some sort of hint from that. I don't typically like to randomly slip into the conversation that I have a boyfriend, so I figured he'd add me on Facebook and see my relationship status and all. So the weekend comes, and I mull over how much I didn't like encountering this guy at the train station. I asked friends for advice, told them everything, and they said to drop him. So what did I plan to do? Avoid him, of course, while also keeping my guard up and seeing what he does. Monday comes and I'm back where I was, walking up to the platform. No sign of him. Phew. And I walked further down on the platform and tucked myself into a space between two freestanding station billboards, and kept my head down. Moments later, I'm tapped on the shoulder. It's him. I gave him a simple nod and boarded the train. I knew he was right behind me. Luckily, on the train, we got split between the conductor. Then I get a message on my phone from my Facebook Messenger app. Sorry, got caught up with the conductor. I replied, no problem. I just wanted to listen to music by myself today anyway. Left it at that. When I got to my stop, I'm pretty nervous at this point to make that 2-minute walk back to my car. I call up my boyfriend just to make myself look busy as I got off, and to have him on the line in case of something. I'm walking to my car now, being pretty sneaky about how I walk to it, weaving in and out of rows of cars. Then out of my peripherals I see him following me. Even though I was taking the most inconvenient paths possible, he was on my tail, and it was pretty clear that I was using a phone. My voice got a little more distant and my boyfriend asked what was wrong. Finally he catches up to me, and we cross paths and I randomly decide to say, "Babe," mid-conversation to my boyfriend on the phone, hoping this guy would hear and back off like, "Okay, she's probably talking to her boyfriend, I'll leave her be." Nope, he's still following me. Finally, I sped walk to my car, and this time he was parked in a different spot and different row from me. Phew. Got in my car, drove home. I'm not a particularly paranoid person, and this was the first time someone actually creeped me out, to the point of me having to put real thought into ways to avoid this guy. After the phone incident, I continued to avoid him for another 2 weeks. Finally, while trying to remain once again inconspicuous at the station, I see a shadow next to me, but I keep my eyes on my phone. Then he bends down and waves his large hand up at me to get my attention. I looked up. He asked me where I've been, and that it's been 2 weeks, as if he was keeping track. And then I told him, "You know, I realized I prefer to be by myself at the station, just listening to music and all. I'm sorry." He gave the most ridiculous scowl I've ever seen on a human, gave a quick, "Okay," and walked off. Phew, home free, problem solved. Or so I thought. When I arrived back at the parking lot, I went to my car, without hardly a worry now. I didn't rush as much this time, pulled out of the parking lot and made my way home. When I was about 5 minutes away from my house, I see an old red car speeding in the opposite direction. It was that classic Monte Carlo, and the driver looked familiar. My heart's racing at this point. My gut told me it was him. I wondered why he was driving around there. I knew his town was not in this direction at all. Was he looking for me in my car? He knew the general direction that I went in to get home because his car was behind mine when we pulled out of the station one day. That scared the living hell out of me, and I hoped to never ever see him and that stupid car ever again. Luckily I didn't. Today I still see him out of the corners of my eye, looming around by the top of the stairs to the train station platform. When I walk past, I feel his eyes. But he's not coming over, and he's not speaking. So for now, I feel safe. Several years ago, I was in a bit of a financial pickle. I was 21 with shitty job history, a shitty job, and shitty credit. You know, like most 21-year-olds. My living situation went sideways and I had temporarily moved back home with my folks. As anyone who has ever had to move back home as an adult will tell you, this was a terrible, horrible situation. And I was in a rush to get back out on my own. Which is why when my best friend, similar position in life at the time, told me that an apartment had opened up at her shady-ass complex, I actually jumped at it. If you're from around here, then you'll know that every apartment complex in that town is kind of shadester. But for those of you not from there, this place is a shady non-town outside of another non-town, with more liquor stores than any other establishment, and several apartment complexes with no credit checks and same-day move-ins. A couple months went by, and while the cops did occasionally show up in our parking lot, and you had to watch your step for more than one broken bottle, it wasn't the worst place to live. I worked the night shift at a large retailer, shuffling around freight in the back, hating every minute of every shift. So one night, while I trudged up and down a ladder like a zombie at work, my cell phone fell out of my back pocket. At the top of the ladder, I grabbed at it, obviously missing, and died a little as I saw it smack the ground and go black. No amount of restarting or shaking could fix it. The LCD was completely shot. Fuck, I thought to myself, and decided this was a good enough reason to go home mid-shift. Remember that thing I said about shitty job history? Yeah, you can clearly see why. Driving home at 3 a.m. on some random weekday, night shifters know how weird it is keeping track of actual days of the week. I turned onto the dark back road that led to my apartment building. I saw something faintly up ahead in the road, and immediately think it's someone's dog. I pulled up slower, praying that I wasn't coming up on someone's dead pet, and saw that there was actually a teenage boy laying on the side of the road waving. There was a bike laying in the dirt next to him. Holy shit! The kid saw me and jumped up, weaving toward the driver's side of my car. Now, I may have made a lot of poor decisions at this point in my life, but thankfully I hadn't gone completely brain dead. I suddenly thought of all the warnings to young women about how serial killers and rapists would lure girls in by playing to their kind hearts. I locked the car doors, but cracked the driver's side window. Are you okay? What happened? Let me get some help. I got hit by a car. They fucking left me. I need help. The kid looked dazed and was scuffed up, but something about him also set my nerves on edge. I'm going to call for help, okay? I grabbed at my cell phone, and then remembered the damn thing was basically useless due to its ladder plunge. My cell phone is broke, but I live nearby here, okay? I will get help. I hoped he didn't think I was lying, but then I didn't care. The kid slammed his hand against my car. Just let me in. I need help now. I promise I will get help and come back. Everything will be okay. I felt torn. I wasn't going to let this kid into my car, but at the same time I couldn't blame him. If I was scared and hurt, I would probably be frantic too. The kid slammed his hand against the car again and I started driving. I hadn't been exaggerating, it was a 30-second drive to my apartment. I didn't have a landline and I didn't want to somehow lead this kid to an empty apartment with no way of calling for help. I saw my best friend's boyfriend's car parked in her spot and was immediately thankful for the stroke of luck. I ran up the steps to her apartment and began banging on the door. Roy answered the door, probably expecting a crazy person, and was immediately even more alarmed to see me. What's going on? Why aren't you at work? I breathlessly explained that some kid had been hit by a car off the back road, but my cell wasn't working, and that I needed him to come back with me. Melanie, my best friend, emerged from her room, sleepy and equally confused. Roy immediately took charge, told us both to get into the car, and drove us back to the boy. The kid was still there waving us down. Roy, a large man, Mel and myself all got out of the car. Help! I need help! I'm here to help. My friend saw you and came and got me, okay? Calm down. I got jumped by this gang, man. They beat me up and stole my backpack and rode off. The kid said frantically. I immediately became alarmed. That's not what he told me at all. I looked at Mel, my face clouding over. I thought you got hit by a car. Why did the gang jump you? What? Yeah, they beat me up and then someone hit me with a car. Plausible. I was still confused though. Roy also seemed wary of this change in the story. Listen man, let me call an ambulance, okay? You tell me your name? The kid lost his shit. He screwed his face up and clenched his fists, hitting the side of his head. No, 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 no! Just let me in the car, man. Just take me to your house. Roy was done. That's not happening, kid. I'll call an ambulance and the police. And I can wait with you till they get here. But we can't bring you back with us. The kid slapped the side of his head some more, and then, in the most disturbing thing I've ever seen, grabbed fistfuls of his shaggy hair and began pulling it out of his scalp. That sound is still the most disgusting and alarming thing I've ever heard. Roy gave Mel and I get the fuck out face, and we jumped back in the car. I'm calling the police, okay? I will tell them you've been hurt and you need an ambulance. Roy began dialing, and the kid began stomping around and screaming, Take me to your house. Just get me in the car. Why won't you take me home? Fuck you, fuck you, fuck you, fuck you. The kid stood in the street, blood trickling from where he'd torn up his scalp. Roy got back in the driver's seat and spoke with the cops as the kid raged outside. He then came to the window, staring so intently at us that I felt like my skin had shriveled up and fallen off. He began kicking the tires, and Roy, clearly fucking over it, drove off. The kid grabbing frantically at the back of the car. Roy drove past our turn, around Peters Creek twice to avoid leading the kid to the apartment complex, and then back down our road. The kid was gone. The bike, the kid, just gone. No idea where he took off to. We never saw the kid again. We searched the papers and internet to see if he'd been picked up, or if any other strange things had taken place that night. But nothing else ever showed up. What confuses me still about it all is why he would demand to come back with all three of us. One person could obviously be overtaken, but what the hell were his plans for all three of us? I started university in September. I didn't know anyone else there at all and quickly became really good friends with all my flatmates. They're all amazing people, and I love them to bits. We live on campus, so getting to class is really handy. No problems whatsoever with my flatmates. However, there is a slight concern I have about a guy on my course. I met him after it started. He was friendly, kind, and I could chat away to him easily. I would sit next to him in class most days, and he was always super nice. As university students do, my flat and I went out one night to a nightclub. He texted me a good few hours before asking what I was up to. I said I was going out, and he asked if he could come, and I didn't see a problem with it. We get there, and he felt my hips, waist, arse area, and it made me very uncomfortable while at the bar. It's here I'd like to clarify I didn't show any interest in him at all, as I wasn't and am not interested at all. I didn't show him any affection, make a move of any kind of his advances, and I made it clear I wasn't interested when I rejected him when he tried for a kiss. That night, I brought someone else home anyway though, and we all felt bad. It turns out later he went home earlier anyway, and he came over when we got back uninvited. We live on campus, which has many blocks of flats, and he lives in a 2-minute walk from me. He rang the bell. We were confused as to why he was there, but Okay. We continued drinking anyway. He seemed quite jealous when he arrived to see the fella I came home with sitting there. But he stayed. He asked to use the bathroom. We each have ensuite ones, not one for everyone. And because he was my friend, I let him use mine. He left shortly after, and when I myself went to use the bathroom, I found that 2 pairs of my underwear that had been worn had been taken out of the washing bag and left in my bathroom. No one had been in my room aside from him. My flatmates and the fella I came home with told me he seemed really into me, and I genuinely didn't realize and felt bad but a little creeped out. Now this happened on Wednesday. I went to bed early around 10, but was on my phone talking to my friends from home, and was going to sleep soon after as I had to meet with someone early the next day. He texted me saying, "Hi, what's up?" and all that. I replied because I was still pretty friendly with him. He was drunk and invited me to his. I said no. I was in bed about to go to sleep. Then he asked if he could come over. Again, I said no, I was going to bed. He asked repeatedly and I kept saying no, I was going to sleep. He asked what block I was in, even though he was in it before. I stopped replying after the 7th time he asked me if he came over. I heard someone walking outside my ground floor window, and I thought that it seriously couldn't have been him. I didn't want to look out, so I messaged my flatmate to peek out. He described who was standing outside my window, and it was him. I could hear the leaves beneath his feet, and I was pretty creeped out. Then he rang the bell multiple times, and it's a loud buzzer and sounds far scarier when there's someone you don't want outside. He then messaged me saying he was lost and to come outside. He wanted to see me, etc. I then heard the leaves crunching again, and him trying the window that I foolishly left open, even though we are advised to, as our rooms can get quite damp. He was really trying to get it open, and thankfully it was on a latch. I was terrified. I texted my flatmates what to do, and they didn't know what to do either. And the boys were willing to go out and confront him, but I told them not to, as for all I knew he could become a violent drunk. I seen him the next day, and I didn't know what to do. He didn't apologize or message me. A girl that we both know told me today at work she gets a bad vibe from him, and that she doesn't trust him. She enlightened me on the fact that he likes me a lot and talks about me all the time. She also told me that he's in the same flat as her friend, and that he walks in randomly into her room even though she could be changing or getting showered at any point. I don't know if I should ask him about it, but I'm not very comfortable with talking to him anymore. Also, I would like to know what to do if he were ever to do the same again. So this story involves myself and a male co-worker, and has been going on now for approximately a year and a half. I've been working at my current job for about 3 years, so I have known this co-worker, we'll call him Bob, for the same length of time. Bob and I had always got on fairly well at work. We often joked with each other, and our relationship was sort of flirty at times. I always thought he was a nice guy, although he sometimes seemed a little odd. I just put it down to shyness. I'd heard some stories about him here and there, that he had some personal problems going on, going through a messy divorce, drinking, being a bit of a loner, etc. But I suppose I like to judge people based on my personal experience, and I don't buy too much into workplace gossip. I have since learned that gossip often contains an element of truth. One evening in March 2015, I was reading through some messages I'd received on a dating app I was using at the time, when I came across a message from a guy with no profile picture. Normally I would skip over these messages because I think the lack of a picture shows that the guy hasn't really put much thought or effort into his profile. But for some reason I clicked. To my surprise, it was a friendly message from Bob, with a mobile number attached. Thinking this was just a coincidental encounter, I gave him my number and we began texting. After exchanging messages for a couple of hours, Bob confided in me that he was in need of someone to talk to and asked if we could meet up somewhere to talk. This was close to midnight, and although I stay up late, I was already dressed for bed. At first I turned him down, but after some pleading on his part, I agreed to meet him at the end of my driveway, so as not to wake my housemate. I went out to meet Bob in my pajamas, and soon realized how naive I had been to think he just wanted to talk. In my defense, this was a guy who I'd known for a while, and who I felt sorry for. So I didn't think to dress up for the occasion. He came fully dressed and wearing cologne. Bob and I sat at the end of my driveway for about an hour just making small talk, and it was obvious that the sob story of needing a friend had been a ruse to get me to meet him. He broached the subject of dating, which I politely declined, but said I'd think about it. I still hadn't seen any red flags at this point. At this point, the situation had become a little awkward, and I made an excuse that I was tired and that I was going to head inside. We hugged, and then as we pulled away, he appeared to be looking at something over my shoulder. I turned to see what he was looking at, and as I turned back, Bob kissed me. For several painful moments, I stood there stiff as a post, totally surprised by this. It didn't even occur to me to push him away. I quickly said goodbye and headed back inside, feeling a little unnerved by the whole thing. Again, this all felt like a plan to get me to meet up away from work. Before I went to bed, I received several follow-up texts telling me how much he enjoyed kissing me and that he would kiss me again when he saw me at work the next day. I asked him not to do that, as I had not agreed to dating him. The following day at work, Bob didn't kiss me, thankfully, but he was much more flirty than usual, touching me affectionately on the arm or waist as he passed me. At some point during my shift, I bumped into my cousin and her boyfriend, who was another co-worker of mine and Bob's, and told them what had happened. The response from my cousin's boyfriend was my first red flag. No, just no. Stay away from him. Don't even go there. Though I asked for more information, he would not elaborate. Part of me was a little annoyed because I didn't like being told what to do, but common sense kicked in and I realized that my cousin and her boyfriend were looking out for me. I decided that I would tell Bob I was not interested in him, about 2 or 3 days after our rendezvous on the driveway. In this time, Bob had been texting, calling me quite a lot, asking me to hang out at strange hours, bitching about his ex-wife, telling me he missed me. For the most part, I had begun ignoring him. I rang him and told him that I had decided we would remain friends. He was a little disappointed, but seemed to take it well overall. I went to work. Bob had the day off, and thought nothing more of it. While I was at work, he sent me a text message that said, "I hate the friend zone. I would like to see if anything evolves." This both creeped me out and made me angry, because I had been very clear that I was not interested, and he seemed to be refusing to accept my decision not to date him. Not to mention he had been inundating me with texts and phone calls for the past few days, and starting to show his true colors. I sent back a text firmly reiterating my decision, and he proceeded to send me multiple messages that were designed to guilt and manipulate me into feeling sorry for him so I would change my mind. I became annoyed and told him that I didn't think having a relationship outside of work was a good idea, and that we should keep things professional between us from now on. Within an hour of sending my final text, Bob showed up at work, on his day off when he lives 20 to 30 minutes away. I saw him arrive and my heart started pounding, because I knew that he had driven there with the express purpose of seeing me. After chatting briefly with a few other co-workers, he walked up to me. His speech was slurred, and he stunk of alcohol. He tried to talk to me, but I told him that I was not willing to discuss the situation with him while I was working. I quickly immersed myself in work so that he would leave, which he did after a few minutes. Towards the end of my shift, he rang the work phone and tried to talk to me again. I begged him to leave me alone and hung up. Needless to say, I had multiple missed calls and texts on my personal phone as well. After this incident, I became very cold towards him and rarely answered any of his attempts at contact. I also confided in the security guards at work. I worked nights, and asked them to accompany me when Bob was around so that I wouldn't have to deal with him. I should explain that this was not because I thought Bob would hurt me, but more so he couldn't talk to me while I was on breaks or leaving work. Since this incident, Bob has made attempts to contact me both at and outside of work, sometimes with months in between. I have not reported him to my boss for several reasons which I won't get into, but things have calmed down a great deal now. Here are some of the most bizarre things he has done that I can remember over the past 18 months. Drunkenly rang me both at work and on my personal phone, often leaving voicemails that are so slurred I can't understand what he's saying. Contacted me through a variety of different social media platforms, Facebook, dating apps, etc., despite me telling him not to contact me. Continually asked me out, despite me repeatedly telling him no, and then talking about being depressed and wanting to hurt himself. Confided in me about very personal issues, many of which are likely completely untrue or exaggerated, even though we hardly know each other. On one occasion, he invented a girlfriend whose name was almost identical to mine. He told everyone at work about her, and then tried to ask me out again. When I mentioned his girlfriend, he confessed to me that he made her up to make me jealous. Invited me over to his place in the middle of the night, and asked me to pick him up from different places, despite me telling him I wanted nothing to do with him outside of work. Asked me to pretend to be his girlfriend when I refused to actually date him. Repeatedly brought up the time he kissed me and told me he thinks about it all the time and wishes I'd let him kiss me again. Talked to other co-workers about me, asking them for advice on what to say to get me to agree to dating him. He recently told me he will be going to jail for assault soon, though he wouldn't say what happened, and I'm unsure if this is true. He often exaggerates, makes up stories. Sorry that this was long. There's probably other things I'm forgetting about. I've also recently found out that this guy has been obsessed with me pretty much since I started working there. All of this was very unsettling to me while it was happening, especially since I hardly knew him. Hopefully it's creepy enough for you. The time of the story was freshly 18. I had moved out of my parents' house in my small hometown in SoCal and moved to San Luis Obispo. I loved every minute of it. It was nothing like Southern California. The people were 100% nicer, and the people were just my type. Everything for the first 6 months of me living there was a dream. Honestly, I was in love with the place. I loved going to my classes. I made amazing friends, and every day I had a smile on my face, which is rare for me. But all good things do come to an end, and mine came to a screeching halt. Let me preface this by saying that I am, in my opinion, no way worth stalking. I am no model, no beauty queen, and no fashionista. You can usually catch me in high-waist shorts and some flannel, and my signature look of chronic bitch face. So for me to be targeted was a real shock, and plays into me denying being followed. It all started one day when I was coming back from class. Every day at the same time on the same corner, there was a guy who looked a little older than me, doing the sign spinning thing for the local pizza place. He seemed to have boundless energy for hours, and had some interesting moves. So I would sneak a peek, just to see what he was doing. The first day we made eye contact, he gave me this giant smile that unnerved me, but I smiled right back. This happened for about 2 weeks. He would fight to make eye contact with me, and I would try my best to stare at the red light. The day it became a problem was when he walked in front of a car to lean in my window and tell me my hair looked soft. To avoid confrontation, I thanked him and rolled up the window. The entire time he was smiling and waving at me as I was driving away. I told my friends and they all laughed it off. Keep in mind, SLO is a super safe place. So they soothed me and went back to our usual routine of playing Super Smash Bros. I continued my life as usual for a few silent weeks, until I was at school and made a beeline for the smoking section for a cigarette. All of my friends were there waiting for me, as I was pulling a cigarette from my bag and not really paying attention to where I was walking. I ended up walking into someone, and guess who? I looked up immediately to profusely apologize, and swift as can be, he grabbed my hair. It was really long, and held me in a death grasp. He kept breathlessly saying, "Your hair is so pretty, I need to make it a belt," and was about to literally cut my hair with this knife he pulled out of his pocket. I was panicking. A level 10 meltdown. This guy had me in his grasp and had a knife. As quick as it started, it was over. My giant and lovely friend Dylan grabbed his arm and twisted it back, causing him to drop the knife. The guy took off screaming expletives at me and anyone in earshot. I have to be honest, I was shaking and crying from fear. Everyone was consoling me and called campus security, who in turn called the police, and I gave my statement. I went home shaken up that night, literally looking over my shoulder everywhere I went. I swear this guy spawned places like it was Halo. When I went home, I realized that he had actually cut off some of my hair in the process. I was so pissed off that I decided to just cut it all off. I left my house with my aunt, and we made our way to the downtown, to this sassy hair salon, and they gave me a super cute cut. In a way, I felt better. The one thing he was so obsessed with was gone. Not that I was cutting it off for that reason. He messed it up badly enough for people to notice my hair was off. And I said c'est la vie to that. Not even 2 hours later, I got a phone call from the hair salon. You had to fill out a card with information when you go in. That a man had come in requesting they give him the hair they cut off me a few hours prior. He tried to claim that I was his daughter, and me cutting my hair off was against our religion. And he was infuriated. The woman called me to say that she had kicked the man out because she knew it was bull. At this point, I was on edge and I didn't even want to leave my room. The entire night I contemplated what to do. I was clearly being followed, and he wasn't letting up. I was so shaken up that I decided to skip my Friday class and just stay inside for a day or two to gather my bearings. My uncle came home from his job. He's gone for weeks at a time. He's an engineer for a military company that makes night vision cameras. He brought one of the newest models made for tanks to the house, so that he could see the features more. He aids in design and sales, and would bring home items to tinker with to create a better sales pitch. We played the whole night with the little camera, and had fun with the kids, niece and nephew. I have a terrible history of insomnia, so when everyone had tired out from playing with the camera, I was awake in my room. I heard it. So quiet and yet so loud. Someone was walking into our backyard. I could hear the footsteps. And then, even worse, the creaking of the swing in the tree. I listened for about 10 minutes without moving to make sure what I was hearing was real. I didn't want to terrify the children since they were so young, but knew that I needed to do something, so I creeped into the living room and went to look at the swing, which didn't have anyone in it, but was swinging violently like someone got off and ran. I assumed from me turning off the light. I woke my uncle and my aunt and told them what I heard. We double-checked all the locks on the doors and they dismissed it as me overreacting to nothing. A few days passed and they told me they were going to be heading up further north to visit my other aunt. I tried to seem like I was okay, so I didn't beg them to stay. I told them I was going to have friends staying the night at the house, and they said that was fine. The layout of our house is basically a 2-story house, but the bottom was a giant garage and the top floor was the actual house. Which I want to detail that there is a staircase that leads up to the house, and I would always lock the door that separates the door to the garage and the house. My aunt was notorious for forgetting to lock the outside door on the bottom floor, and the door to the house. My friends came over, and we were hanging out when we heard the bottom door slam open so loud we all stopped moving. My instincts kicked in, and I ran to the garage door and locked the door just in time to hear hands slamming on the door. Then heard the person run to the patio, up the stairs which was already locked, and the curtains drawn. So we never saw the face. We were all shaken up, but they wanted to stay the night since they didn't want to walk to their cars until morning, and we all agreed it was for the best. But at the last second I decided to take the night vision camera and set it on the outside porch railing, looking down on the swing. I was going to prove once and for all that I wasn't messing around. The morning came and went. Nothing interesting happened. I left the camera outside to record for 3 days and stayed at my friend's house for the remainder of my family being away. When my uncle returned, he wanted to know why the camera was outside, and I told him my reasoning. And he wasn't mad. He helped me upload the footage. We combed through hours of just raccoon and animals until we saw it. A male with the same build as the guy who had attacked me. He had a mask on, sitting on the swing for hours. He would walk around the house, try to open the doors, try to get into the garage. The footage for the entire week had him arriving anywhere between 2:30 to 4:30 a.m., doing his routine walk around the house, hoping for an unlocked door, and then leaving. My uncle, aunt, all of us were mortified, watching him creep around the house for close to a week. We decided to go to the police. But unfortunately, we could not use the video we had accrued due to the gear actually belonging to a company that had not given an okay for the gear and video to be used. Legal loophole, trust me. I was screaming internally the entire time. I gave my statement, and the police patrolled my house for around a week or so, not seeing any activity. My aunt and uncle refused to leave me alone a second time around. And just as quick as the stalking started, it stopped. No more nighttime visits, no more following me. I moved out of the area shortly thereafter to move back to LA for my career in film. But honestly, when I think about it, I will still look over my shoulder. Around 10 years ago, I was a student on study leave, so I was studying from home for my finals. Being a procrastinator, I naturally started revision late in the afternoon and worked through the night till early morning. This worked out for my dad. Since he would work late shifts, he would return home around midnight after catching the last train home, so I could drive to pick him up from the train station. I didn't mind, since I had recently passed my driving test and loved the quiet roads. He would call me about a stop or two before getting off the train, so that gave me time to drive to the station. So, as usual, I received his call and proceeded to exit the front door. Just as I did that, I saw a tall figure standing opposite my driveway, standing right in front of my car, blocking the exit. I don't know how long he was standing there before I saw him, but I live right next to an open space park in London, so seeing people like that isn't at all uncommon, especially at this time of night. They are usually druggies or loafers who hang around near the entrance, but they do clear off as soon as they see me exit the house. But this time it was different. This person just stood there mumbling and groaning to himself. He was wearing a long black coat with the hood up, standing perfectly still, with his back facing towards me. I waited near the front door for a little while, but I didn't know what to do, so I closed the door. I don't think he saw me. I went to my parents' bedroom where my mother was sleeping and woke her up to tell her about the strange person outside. Their bedroom faces the front of the house, so we peeked out the window with the lights off. He had started pacing from one end of our driveway to the other, with his eyes fixated on our house, and he had one hand inside his jacket. I told my mother to call the police, but she was reluctant to do so. She never speaks to the authorities even in emergency situations, because English isn't her first language, so she never had the confidence to talk to anyone who didn't speak her language. I also struggled with severe anxiety back then. To an extent, still do today. So it was out of the question for me to call the police. I could barely muster the courage to leave the house, so in this situation, I felt like a deer glaring helplessly at the oncoming headlights of death. The man then stopped and proceeded to walk towards our house. He was holding something which resembled a black rod or stick of some sort. It was too dark to see what it was, and I was literally paralyzed with fear. It seemed as if he was trying to look through our window in the living room, but the curtains were drawn. I think he was trying to peek through the spaces between the curtains. I'm guessing he didn't see anything because the lights were off. I kept the light on in my study room, but that faces the garden out back. He turned around and dropped what he was holding in our recycling basket before walking off into the darkness of the open space. There are no lights in the park next to us, so it's pitch black. Our recycling baskets in London don't have lids, so they are open. As soon as he walked off, me and my mother walked towards the basket, curious to see what he dropped in there, and were horrified to find that it was a knife. It was very long, and was encased in a thick black skill-like sheath. It was heavy. I don't know anything about knives to make a judgment, but this thing can do some real damage. My mother immediately put the knife in the main general use garbage tin. While driving home with my dad, we discussed what had happened. Since we didn't see the person's face or see where he went after disappearing into the darkness, we decided not to report this to the authorities. We never saw him again. Looking back at this incident, I should have called the police. We were lucky he didn't try to break into our house, or don't know what would have happened. My family were in danger, and I just stood there watching it happen. I've since used this as motivation to work on my anxiety, so I'm better equipped at handling situations if it were to happen again. I still can't figure out what his intentions were or why he targeted our house in particular. I named this story Litterbug because in high school, we were actively told to recycle, and students who disposed of an item incorrectly, plastic and general waste, were called litterbugs. This happened a little over 3 months ago in July. I'm still scared shitless of walking home alone to this day. So, important details first. I live in a fairly populated and safe part of Toronto, and I go to a university about 20 to 25 minutes away by public transit, not including the 10-minute walk from my house to the subway, 10 minutes in the subway, and roughly 10 to 15 more minutes on the bus. I was just starting second semester, and to my utter dismay, all of my courses were in the morning. All except for one. It was my Aboriginal Studies class, which was held every Tuesday from 6 to 9 p.m. My professor at the time was known for rarely showing up to class and instead setting up online classes to make up for her absences. So I often found myself showing up to class only to find that it was either cancelled or it was being held online. I never checked my email. It was a very rainy Tuesday night, and as usual, I headed to the university to go to my class. I entered the room and sat there for a good 15 minutes, waiting for everyone else to show up. At that point, I started to notice something was weird. I checked my email from last night to find this. Dear students, unfortunately, I'm still sick from last week. It is really slow going, and I am about 50% improved. But I'm not enough improved to make it to tomorrow's class. We also have gotten a ton of snow where I live, and the driveway is blocked. However, I do not want to delay our class schedule, so I'm going to hold class online tomorrow. I will be sending you a link to access the class, and you will be able to access it from anywhere with internet access. There will not be video functionality, but there will be audio, chat, and textful communication. Please check your email for a follow-up message with a link for our class tomorrow. So this class ended up being cancelled again, and I was too pissed off to follow the link to the online class. So I packed up my shit and decided to go home. I got off the subway around 6:40 p.m. and I started to walk home. It was a 10-minute walk from the subway station, in which I had to walk on the sidewalk, cross the road, turn right, and turn left again into my condo. Sorry if this is a little hard to grasp. Besides, nothing dangerous has ever happened to me before, so I assumed my walk home would be a safe one, as usual. Nothing struck me as scary until about 3 minutes into the walk, when I heard a man's voice quietly murmur something. I also had earbuds in, so I didn't hear a word, and just brushed it off as someone talking on the phone or something. As I took another step, I heard it again. I took off my earbuds and turned around this time and saw a tall man with an exceptionally large build staring at me and smiling. I stupidly pointed at myself to say, "You talking to me?" And he yelled back, "Yes, you," while smiling. He quickly turned around and jaywalked the street with his friends. Being paranoid as hell, I looked on as he seemingly walked in the opposite direction I was heading, and we were separated by 2 streets. This wasn't enough to erase my worries though. I was still scared as fuck. I felt it. I knew he crossed the street, and that he was not likely to bother me again. But something just didn't feel right. My heart started pounding like crazy, and I felt the need to look back every 5 seconds. I was around 5 minutes away from my house when I noticed how empty my neighborhood was. Not a single person in sight, which added even more to the creep factor. All of a sudden, I had this sensation that could only be described as the hair on the back of my neck standing up. I slowly turned around again. I almost shat my pants. There he was, at the edge of the road, standing there. He then started to fucking chase me. It all happened so fast. It took me a second for me to go from, "Oh god, how did he even manage to find," to, "Holy shit, run." The guy was way fitter than I initially anticipated. As he was starting to catch up to me, I was absolutely terrified. Even with all the adrenaline pumping throughout my body, I was barely able to sprint in my huge, bulky hunter rain boots. Thankfully, without slipping or falling, I managed to run into my condo lobby before he could catch me. I was panting, shaking, and crying, and everyone in the lobby was staring at me. I looked inside the glass walls and saw him stop, look around, and leave when he couldn't find me. I made one of the security guards walk me to my room, and I didn't dare come out for the rest of the night. I later figured that when the man first crossed the road, he was watching and followed me from the other side of the road, and jaywalked when he saw that I was entering a quieter area where I could easily be isolated. It scares me that if I wasn't so overly paranoid that night, he could have easily grabbed me from behind, abducted me, or who knows, maybe much worse. So, Mr. Rapist, serial killer, or whatever the hell you are, let's not meet. So I just turned 16 exactly 3 weeks ago. But I have this weird habit of rounding up my age months before my birthday, meaning I've been saying I'm 16 for a few months now. I like to spend a lot of my time at the local library. I'm homeschooled with 3 siblings, so it's pretty much the only chance I have to do my work in a quiet, neat place. About the beginning of this last summer, I noticed some guy was at the library every single time I was. At first I thought nothing of it, as there's plenty of people I've noticed coming to the library regularly. But one day, I noticed something way off. I had finished all my schoolwork for the year, and was just dicking around playing games on one of the library computers, when I noticed the same guy sitting 2 computers down from me. I smiled and nodded at him, then continued my game. The internet on my computer started going off, however, so I switched over to the other side of the computer desk and logged onto that one. Lo and behold, creepy guy, who I'll refer to as CG from here on out, switched over to the other side as well, sitting right next to me and staring at my computer screen as if I was blind and wouldn't notice. I immediately got a bad feel about this scoob and texted my mom to tell her I'd be stopping by the pharmacy next door to pick up her prescriptions for her, just so I'd have an excuse to leave. Apparently, though, CG wasn't done yet and followed me outside. He stopped me right outside the library and asked me for my name and how old I was. I told him I'm Hamming. I'm 16 years old. He informs me that his name is Jonathan and he's 46. He then proceeds to tell me that I'm one good-looking 16-year-old and walk away. This dude looks about as stereotypical meth user as you can get. Scruffy beard, gel-spiked hair, dirty band t-shirt, and ripped-up cargo shorts. So I just figured he was your run-of-the-mill creep. The next day, I had a writers group meeting at the very same library. So I left my house and started walking for it. I'll spare you the tedious details, but halfway through my walk, I noticed CG following behind me on a bike. I was creeped out, but I didn't want to seem crazy, and I simply chalked it up to him walking the same way as me. To be sure, I ended up taking 2 right turns, both of which he followed. I was officially bugged out, so I turned onto our town's main road, which led straight to the library. He followed me the entire 3/4 of a mile there. At some point, I don't remember, I pulled out my phone and texted my girlfriend what was going on, and then called her until I got to the meeting. When I got to the meeting, I explained to the group leader what was going on, and she offered to drive me home afterwards. 2 hours later, and we leave to see CG still waiting outside the library, glaring at us all the way to the car. A few weeks went by without a CG encounter, so he was all but forgotten by me. Until the day he proposed to me. I was walking home from the grocery store with some snacks when I noticed him sitting outside the laundromat I passed on my way home. I groaned internally and decided ignoring him was the best bet until he ran after me. I can't remember the word-for-word conversation, but it went something like, Hey, how old are you now? Still 16? I don't believe you. Now, I have no idea why I didn't just knock him out then and there, but I didn't. And instead, I pulled out my student ID and showed it to him. What he said next, I'll probably never forget. Oh, shit. Well, are you emancipated? No. You should get emancipated. Why? Because then you can marry me. Nah, I promise I'll take care of you, and our kids would be so cute. I booked it out of there, and after a couple more incidents of him following me around, he sort of dropped off the map. Until back in August, he cornered me in a gas station to demand to know why I acted so scared around him and to stop doing that. I haven't heard from or seen him since, but to this day the idea of him freaks me the fuck out. For some background, my mother is a single mother because my dad left before I was born. She works very hard, and in the whole 17 years leading up to this point, it was always just me and her. She never had a boyfriend or anything like that, but just before my 17th birthday, this is what happened. It wasn't long before Christmas, and my mother had told me that she was speaking to one of her old friends from school on Facebook and was going to ask him to come round for some food and drink as a catch-up. At this point, I had no male role model in my life whatsoever, so I can't say I wasn't a little excited that my mother had finally met someone after so long. On the day he came round, I was out most of the night because my mother had bought me 2 tickets to see 50 Cent for me and a friend as an early Christmas present. So we went, and my friend stayed over after. This is when I first made contact with the man I'll call Dan. So he stands up, shakes my hand, and tells me he's heard a lot about me. And all seems good. He even bought us food and convinced my mum to give me another early Christmas present, so I liked him already. If only I knew then what I know now. So now you're all caught up. That happened around November. So fast forward to January, which is when my birthday is, and I was turning 17. Now this had already started to feel a bit weird to me, because Dan had already moved into my house, but I just thought he might have been struggling. Even though he always went on about that he worked offshore on the oil rigs, he had 3 houses that are all up for rent. So you would expect him to have a fair bit of cash, but never seemed to have any. So anyway, my 17th birthday comes and I ask my mum if I can have a party. Just messing with her because it was obvious she'd say no. And she did. But then Dan overhears and convinces her to let me, and they will both stay so it doesn't get out of hand. So I invite my friends over and we're having a good time. And I'm really starting to like Dan. Even though I had only knew him for a short amount of time, he seemed to understand what it's like to be my age. So the party's going good. Everyone's enjoying it. Then Dan sits in the front room with us. This is where it started to get a little off. I am the funny one in my friendship group, so I made my friends laugh quite a lot, but Dan didn't really seem to like it. I don't really know what he was thinking, but he started talking to all of my friends, as if he were competing with me, and belittling me every chance he got. I thought it was a little weird, but I'd never had a father figure before, so I thought he was just joking. But as the night went on, it got weirder. He came up to me later on and pulled out a tiny bag with cocaine inside and offered me some. Being 17, when your mom's boyfriend offers you coke in front of your friends, that has to be the coolest thing in the world. So I had some. He then said to me, "Don't tell your mum or I'll get into shit." And I agreed I wouldn't. Believe me, I'd be in a lot more shit than he would if I did tell her. So anyway, Dan got more and more drunk, and then started to like my friends more than I did, and made a comment to one of my friend's girlfriends who was 16, and he was late 30s, asking if she wanted to go upstairs, and she said no, and came up to me asking what the fuck his problem was. And I shook it off again, saying he'll just be messing around. So the party's over, And it's a few days later and Dan is acting really weird. Not to my face, but behind my back. For example, my mum would ask me to wash the dishes or to clean my room. And Dan would say, "Don't worry about it. Just leave them. You go out and I'll do it." So I said thanks and went out, and when I'd come home, the dishes wouldn't be done and my room would be a mess, so I'd get into shit for it. It was just stupid things like this that began to make me start thinking. This is where the worst part comes in. My mum and Dan are going out drinking for the night. My mum never normally drinks, but I assume she's just going because he wanted to. So I invited my girlfriend over to stay the night while they were gone, so we ordered food, watched movies, and fell asleep. We were then awoken by my mum screaming, "No, Dan, please, don't." And Dan screaming at her saying, "I'll kill you and your fucking son." So I told my girlfriend to wait in bed and give her a small metal pole from my weight set to defend herself with, in case anything happened. Then I proceeded downstairs. When I got downstairs, it was crazy. There was a hole straight through my TV. The glass cabinet had been smashed, and Dan had my mother by her arm screaming in her face that she's no good, and loads of other horrible things, so I shout, "Get the fuck off her!" They both freeze, then calm down, and straight away he says, "I didn't hit her. Do you really think I'd do that?" In the calmest voice ever. So I did what any mature teenager would do, and punched that cunt straight in the nose. But obviously he has muscles bigger than my waist. I'm not the biggest of mammals to populate this planet. So he just tackles me to the floor and punches me. Then all of a sudden, someone bangs on the door, but they didn't stop to wait to see if anyone answered. It was just repeated until Dan answered the door. My next door neighbor was there with a pole in his hand and said, "Have you been fucking hitting her?" And Dan is extremely calm and says, "What are you talking about?" I then stand in the doorway behind him, bleeding from my nose, and nod. My next door neighbor then drags him outside and they both start fighting on my front garden. And Dan had been hit by the pole, so he was bleeding from his head and had blood down his face. The police then arrived. My neighbor obviously called them before he started swinging poles around, which was a smart move. Dan was then arrested and my neighbor also got taken to court. And my mum stuck up for Dan, but she was obviously just scared, so I made a statement to the police because God only knows what he would have done if my neighbor didn't come. So now Dan's in jail. There's no story about it as proof, but I'm just hoping that you'll believe it. But the weirdest part about it all is that me and my mum talked about it a few months later. And she said, he never had any money, he didn't have 3 houses, he lived with his mum, and had lied about it all. He was just living off me the full time, and he had spent a lot of money. So for a while we thought we would have to sell the house. My mum is a fighter though, so she worked her butt off to pay off all the debts owed and keep the house, but she also said, he told me he took cocaine and always refused to do things he asked. Which I denied at the time, but she knows the truth now. I'm older. But even though I took it, I can't help think that he was trying to get in between me and my mum to bring us down, when in fact, it only made us closer. She's fine now, and we still live in the same house. I asked her about why he hit her, and she said, he said I slept with one of his friends at your party. Which was quite funny because my mum wasn't even there, but That just shows how crazy he was. There were a few more incidents from Dan, so if you want to know more, just comment and I'll get to it when I have spare time. My mum is now with a different man who is one of the nicest people I've ever met. And Dan is married to another woman he was cheating on my mum with the entire time. God help that woman. Dan, let's never, ever, ever meet again. Indian education system is different than that in the West. My school worked in shifts. First shift was for science student, and second one for commerce students. I was a student of second shift. My seat was third bench in front row, shared with my best friend Ira. During first shift, it was used by two guys, Akash and Ansh, both 17. It so happened that once they wrote something bad about girls on the bench, which Ira and I noticed, and we wrote against them. Next day, they left a note on the bottom roof of the bench, apologizing and introducing themselves. Ira and me found it fun, and we replied back. This way we kept exchanging letters every day, without seeing each other, talking about stuff, but not sharing any contact details. One day they wrote about how they want to meet us, and we should wait for them on school's front gate before second shift starts. But we flatly refused since we were not up for anything serious. We also made clear that there'll be no more letters exchanged, and we should stop it now. But the next day before our class, the guys came to our class, giving the excuse that they left something on their table. Meanwhile, just to check me and Ira out, that was the first time we saw them as well. After that, there was no conversation between us. Then one day, when I was entering school, I saw one of my friends, Ayushi, having a chat with Akash. I was puzzled, so I asked her in class. She told me Akash lives near her house, and he proposed her, and how they're in a relationship. I felt strange, and felt like telling her that the guy seems weird, but she was so much in love, I was scared she'll break our friendship. So after a few days, I get a call from this strange number. I pick it up, and it was Akash. He told me he got my info from Ayushi, and just wanted to be friends with me since now he was my friend's boyfriend. I told him fine. We chatted sometimes for a few days, and everything was fine until one day he proposed me. I made him clear that I'm not interested in him, and now I am not up for chat. He began begging me not to do that. I blocked his number and he got a new number. He started emotionally blackmailing me through messages that he'd kill himself if I don't talk. He would make small cuts in his hands and send pics. He told me we should marry and have babies. I ignored them and blocked the second number, then the third, then the fourth. I felt like telling my parents, but I was scared their solution would be taking away my phone, so I never did. After a while, it stopped. We completed schooling and all started a new journey to college. During 2013, when I was pursuing graduation, I got his friend request on my Facebook account. I didn't accept, but we had mutual friends and he could see some of my pics. He made some borderline vulgar comments, and I blocked him on Facebook. He again got my number, which I had changed by now, but since we had mutual friends, it was easy for him to get. He tried to pretend he was someone else, saying he was X's friend, and he saw me at that party and found me gorgeous and all that, but I somehow knew it was him, and I told him I am not interested in talking to strangers. Again, he tried to emotionally blackmail me, telling me he's standing outside my house and he can do anything to me, harm me. I knew he wasn't outside since none of my classmates knew my house. Also, I was already going through a rough time due to my mom's ill health, so I buzzed him off and gave him a last warning that next time I'll go directly to the police. He again stopped then, only to start once again with one more new number after a few days. He began sending me horrific messages, telling me he'll get me gang raped by his friends, and voice messages telling me how they'll rape me and enjoy it. I was at college at that time, and I decided that today I'll tell my mom everything, and we'll complain to the police. I was standing near my college room's window and thinking when I saw Akash roaming on another street road. I got shit scared. I was sure he got to know my college's location and he was stalking me. I had told my college friends about it, and we decided to complain about him then and there, since my location was just 1 minute away from that area's police station. We got there and told the police everything. They arrested him. And then there was a lot of drama with family involved. Police seized his phone and got that I wasn't the only girl he was sending messages to. There were a few more. In fact, he sent visual, explicit materials as well. Also, he had videos of the how to kill without leaving a clue and how to stab with a knife type. I was glad I took action before it was too late. His mom cried a lot and apologized on his behalf and requested that I take my complaint back. But my dad flatly refused. My dad was really angry with me for not telling him until now. He's in prison right now. Last year, the court punished him with 7 years of imprisonment. His family is trying to appeal in higher court now. I just hope he never comes out. This happened to me in 8th grade. So I was only 13 to 14 years old. Me and my best friend at the time, who happened to be my classmate also, Ella, decided to skip some classes. It was a wonderful spring day and we wanted to go for a walk, to enjoy the beautiful things that nature has to offer for that season. After 1 hour or 2 of wandering the streets, not far from the school in my neighborhood, we decided to go to a small park which was in the opposite direction. It wasn't an unknown territory, so we continued our walk pretty relaxed. Just before arriving at the park, there was this particular street that wasn't very populated. Not in a deserted way, but very few people walked by. Just as we reached the middle of this street, we noticed some people behind us, behaving pretty strange. There was a girl, maybe in her early 20s, accompanied by 2 boys younger than her. We started to walk a little faster, and they seemed to follow us. When we finally made it to the park, we hopped on a bench and kept our eyes on the strangers. They stopped a few meters from the entrance and spoke to one another for some minutes, glaring at us. I told Ella that I have a very bad feeling about this, and that if they enter the park, we should leave immediately. She said she felt the same way, and she agreed with me. A few minutes passed by, and the three of them made their way into the park, still looking at us constantly. We instantly got up and walked to the other end of the park, leaving to make our way back to the neighborhood. On that same bloody street, they caught up to us and began to ask for directions to some church. Ironic, huh? We said we haven't heard of that church and tried to leave. That's when the shit started to get real. The woman got in front of us, starting to ask for money. When we refused to give her any, she pulled a knife out of her pocket and said that she would stab us right then and there if we wouldn't give her all of our money and jewelry. It's important to mention at this time I was obsessed with rings, so I had my fingers full of them. Somehow, before they got to us, I had the bright idea to put my phone underneath my shirt just in case. Needless to say, I was scared shitless at this point. I felt my heartbeat rising with every second that was passing. But I tried very hard to hide this from the attackers. Until this day, I have no idea where I found the courage to say no right into her face. Ella instead was freaking out. She was crying, shaking, and begging them to leave us alone. She even gave them her money. I, on the other hand, knew that this kind of behavior would only make things worse. I told her to calm down and tried to find a way to escape. I saw a man walking across the street and started to yell, hoping that he would come to see what was happening. But he hadn't even looked on our way. The woman got angrier and told the other guys to take our jewelry by force. Of course, they came for me first. I had at least 7 or 8 rings, but I knew how to hold my hand in a position that they wouldn't come off. I started to fight back and hit them as hard as I could. One of them even bit my hand. During this whole mess, I remembered that at the end of the street there was a supermarket, and more important, they had security. I knew that we have to try to get there as fast as we could, so I waited for a moment of distraction from the attackers, grabbed Ella's hand, and ran. They tried to catch us, but I fought them all the way to the supermarket stairs. We didn't stop until we got to the middle of the shop. After catching our breaths, and made sure they didn't follow us into the supermarket, we made our way to the security guy. I told him what happened and asked him to keep an eye out for them until we call somebody to come and pick us up. Ella called her boyfriend to come and help us, and after she told him this story, he said that he knew who she was talking about. Apparently they were junkies that used to rob people for money to buy drugs. When he got there, the junkies were already gone, and we felt relieved for the first time in hours. After that incident, I didn't wear my rings for a very long time when I would leave the house. I was always looking back and feeling like somebody was watching me. And even after I got over those feelings, I did my best to avoid that street no matter what. The funny thing is, my high school was in that direction too, so for the first 3 years, I was taking the subway to get there until some of my classmates convinced me to take that route again. Fortunately, I never ran into them again. I recently moved to a new city, and I've been walking almost everywhere in order to get a better handle on my surroundings. It's actually kind of nice to live someplace where everything you need is in walking distance. I live in a large metro city on the west coast, and it's pretty well populated, so I feel safe walking alone most of the time. A couple of nights ago, I just got back from running errands when my boyfriend texted me from work and asked if I could pick up something at the store for him. I was admittedly a tiny bit annoyed, as I had just got back to the apartment, but I said okay. I figured I could just drive back to the store. And again, the weather has just finally started getting nice here, so I decided to walk instead. The store is just a little over a mile away, and I was sure I could be there and back in no time, so I headed out. I'm prone to getting lost in the grocery store, drugstore, Target. I'll go in for one thing and find myself wandering around for quite a while, and suddenly my basket is full of things I never knew I needed. This evening was no exception, and I wound up lurking around the store for about an hour, tossing random things in the basket. I realized time and daylight was getting away from me, and I quickly checked out. I stepped out of the store. The air was still warm, but the sun was beginning to set. I started walking back towards the apartment the same way I had come. It was uneventful for the most part, and quieter than usual. I passed a few people out for an evening jog, and a dog walker or two, but no one else. I was about halfway home, and heading into a slightly less populated, more industrial neighborhood when I stopped at a crosswalk, waiting for the light to change. The walk light was just about to come on for me, when a man who looked like he was about to cross the street heading toward me suddenly walked in front of traffic that was beginning to move, and crossed perpendicular to me. So once I crossed, he was now heading in the same direction as me, instead of away from me, just on the other side of the street, if that makes any sense. He was a young guy, maybe younger than me, early to mid-20s. He was decent looking and seemed well groomed. He was wearing grey jeans, a black t-shirt, and an orange hoodie. But something about the way he walked put me off. I don't really know how to explain it, but something about his walk just struck me as strange. The way he just ambled out into the street. Something was strange about him. I actually needed to cross to the side of the road he was on, but I was on alert. And something told me to keep my distance. So I stayed on my side of the street and kept heading in the direction of my apartment, feeling his eyes on me as I walked. Sure enough, as soon as some people passed him on the sidewalk, he began accosting them. Better them than me, I thought. There were two of them, and at least they had a dog. I quickened my pace and looked quickly over my shoulder. The people had brushed him off, and he was hurrying a bit more. It seemed like he was trying to catch up with me. I felt as though he was following me, but I couldn't be sure. He kept talking to himself, or maybe to me. It was hard to make out what he was saying from across the street, but he sounded pissed. We passed an office building, with him being on the same side of the street as the building. A man stepped outside just then to smoke, and Creeper Man began accosting him as well. I used the opportunity to quicken my pace again, I wanted to get away from this dude. I glanced over my shoulder again when he pointed at me. "See that pretty little thing over there?" he said with a smirk to the man having a smoke. I tried to give my best "help me" eyes to the guy with the cigarette. The smoking guy looked super annoyed, and he immediately put his cigarette out and went back inside. "Thanks for nothing, smoking guy." I was totally alone now, and still about a 10-minute walk to my apartment. My city is definitely a walking city, and there are usually people everywhere, but of course, tonight there was no one. Maybe I'm just being silly, I thought. I do have a tendency toward being hypervigilant, so I decided to test him. I quickened my pace to almost a jog. Across the street, so did the man. I slowed down, he did too. I stayed standing at a crosswalk where I had a walk signal. So did he. I crossed against the light when it changed, and he did too. Fuck. And now he was really, really pissed. He was cursing up a storm and flailing his arms about. And his hoodie was off now. I really needed to be on his side of the street in order to get home at this point, but I was too scared to cross. And even if he let me alone, I didn't want him following me all the way to my apartment. I wasn't really sure what to do. I patted my jacket pocket where I usually keep my mace, and I realized I had left it in a different jacket. I was alone and armed with a bag of drugstore goodies. And now it was getting really fucking dark outside. I had walked several blocks out of the way at this point, afraid of getting too near to him. I don't know what kept him from just coming to my side of the street that whole time. I was trying my hardest to ignore him, and I think it was pissing him off, but maybe also keeping him at bay. The whole time, I never felt him take his eyes off me, and he was staring right at me when I dared to glance over. Finally, by some miracle, I came to a busy intersection where several people were standing on the corners. Crazy Creeper Man threw his arms in the air one last time and yelled, "God damn it!" and continued muttering to himself before suddenly turning and running in the opposite direction. I did a run-walk across the street and all the way home, glancing over my shoulder the whole time. I don't know what his intentions were, but it's one of the few times in my life where I've gotten that truly awful feeling in the pit of my stomach about a person. I'm so glad I chanced upon all those people at the right moment. And now I always carry my mace with me. There's something called the 6 degrees of separation theory, which basically states that everyone in the world is separated by, at most, 6 steps. Well, I am separated from Trent Reznor, 9 Inch Nails mastermind, by just 1 step, and it was due to a stalker. Back in 2006, I was living in Atlanta, Georgia, and I had just joined a pretty particular punk band, which mixed a very large sound with cabaret-like visuals. We never made it big, but our act was appealing enough that it got us the attention of many people. One of them was a strange girl, who was always chain-smoking, had a weird aura to herself. and who was always wearing a jacket on her shoulders, meaning her arms were not in the sleeves, and who eventually said she wanted to be our manager. She said she was friends with Slash, Guns N' Roses, that she had managed a couple of bands when she used to live in New Orleans, and whatnot. So we decided to hear her out. Our band was sort of a crazy one, so drugs passed around freely in our parties. This girl, she told us her name was Christy something, would provide us with party favors sometimes, would tell us that she was worth $2 million, that she had 5 scars, that she worked in this luxury building, and that she had a huge house somewhere in the suburbs. The thing is, she was always picking cigarette butts from the street and smoking the filters, like she was a homeless person. Something about her just didn't click particularly with me. She always came to see us in a sort of fancy SUV, so we went along with her stories for the most part. Eventually, Christy fell hard for me, told me she was divorcing her husband and that she wanted to be with me. I was intrigued by her, so I started testing all her stories. I asked to visit her at her office, and she would always make excuses as to why I couldn't, until eventually she told me her office had closed down, and that they were looking for new space. I asked her why she was using the same car if she had like 5, and again, excuses and more excuses. I asked to visit her at her huge house, the same thing. She came up with off reasons as to why she couldn't have me for a visit, mostly that her husband was still there and whatnot. I started to get sick of all her excuses and eventually confronted her that I thought that she was a big fat liar. She got desperate, started to make more excuses, and I just told her to get lost. She had had a previous fight with some of my bandmates before, so she had already been discarded as our prospective manager. She started calling me every day, asking to see me. I would constantly tell her no until one day she showed up at my house around 5 a.m., apparently wasted. She said she had picked up this guy friend of hers to go party, but that he was too drunk, and that he was now passed out in her car, and she didn't know what to do with him. I looked across the street and saw no one in her car, and she said it was because this guy was laying down. I didn't really feel like bothering and going to her car to check it out. She eventually started crying, and I felt bad enough for her that I let her come into my living room. It was at this point that she took off her jacket, and for the first time ever, I realized she was missing her entire left arm. I was already giddy by her showing up at my house drunk and all, that I didn't dare ask how that happened. I know this has nothing to do with my story, but it was something that just added to the already weirded out atmosphere. I hung out with her for a while. At this point, I started doubting that she was actually drunk. I gave her coffee. I told her to please never show up at my house like that again, and eventually told her to just drop the guy at a Waffle House, and then just go home. It might not have been the most responsible thing to tell someone in that state to drive, but I just wanted the whole thing to be over, and like I said, I felt that she was acting drunk the whole time, and she seemed okay enough to drive. She eventually left, and that was that for that night. Next day, again she started stalking me by phone, to the point I just stopped picking up. I worked early hours, and she would call me at 2 or 3 a.m. completely drunk. I eventually got sick of it all and told her to stay away from me and to never call me again. She complied, and for about a week, it seemed like the whole thing was history. Around 6 days later, she calls me again when I was at work. I started telling her that she wasn't supposed to call me, but she said that she could finally invite me to her house, and that she wanted me to come visit her. All sorts of red flags went up for me, so of course, I told her to forget about it, and just hung up on her. She again started calling me at late hours, to the point that I just had to turn off my phone at night. Otherwise, I would never get a good night's sleep. I remember it was a Friday. After waking up, I had a voicemail on my phone, left at around 2 a.m. I checked it out, and it was her saying, "Hi Max, I just took 200 pills and I've been drinking all night. I just wanted to say goodbye and that I love you. Good luck with the rest of your life." Needless to say, I got totally weirded out. I was so sick of her lies. I just deleted the message, completely assuming it was one of her ploys to get me to call her. I decided to forget about it and went to work. Next Tuesday after that, I get another voicemail from her phone, but this time it was a guy's voice. "Hi Max, this is Christy's husband. I'm calling her friends in her contact list to let them know that she passed away last Friday, and we're doing a memorial for her in downtown Atlanta tomorrow. If you want to go, please call me back so I can give you the address." Can't even explain how I felt at that point. I was shocked, and I tried to evade the news by thinking that this was some guy that Christy had manipulated into calling me, just to get me somewhere at some time. But of course, the whole situation didn't make much sense to me. This guy eventually called another of my bandmates, whose name was in Christy's contact list. I told my band about this entire situation, so my bandmate, who had been suspicious of this girl for a while, started prying this guy for more info. We eventually learned that she used a fake name with us the whole time, that her real name was Amber Applebaum, and that she was using a made-up name because she had been in trouble with the law. We googled her, and sure enough, turns out she had stalked Trent Reznor in the past, and even managed to steal his credit card info. She even was arrested for it. I was stunned at this point, unsure of what to do next. We never went to the memorial. We were way too suspicious to do it. To this day, I still don't know if this girl committed suicide for real or if the whole thing was just a sham to get me into some trouble. But since I never heard from her again, I doubt it. Or maybe she's been using a fake name ever since and decided to move on with her life. I'll never know. But it's definitely the worst way to get 1 degree of separation from someone famous. I got rid of my cell phone after that, and it took me 3 years until I felt okay enough to get a new one. I never really want to go through something like that ever again. I am a male, and was around 17 at the time this story takes place, on a winter's night in a small town in southern England. I was over at a friend's house for a few drinks, as we were too young to hit the pubs, and the weather too cold to drink in the woods as usual. My friend lived around 2 miles from where I lived, and around halfway home, there was a shortcut through the woods where we regularly hung out, which would shave a precious few minutes off my walk home. We were having a good time and enjoying a few cans of cider. I think it's a rite of passage for English youth. And at around 11 p.m., I decided to head home as I had work the next morning. I headed out of my friend's house and through the alleyway to the main road. It was here that I noticed someone on the other side of the road, about half a mile back. I thought nothing of it. It's a quiet town, and I had made this walk plenty of times before without issue. As I started walking, I felt an odd sensation, and the hairs on my neck started to stand on end. I turned around to see the person had crossed the road and was now walking on the same side of the road as me. Still a way behind, but I could see it was a large man with a hooded top on. Being a relatively switched-on person, I decided to cross the road to see if he copied me. No sooner had I done that, sure enough, the man followed suit. At this point, I started to nope out and walk faster. I kept checking behind me, and he too was walking faster. And there was a glint of something in his hand. Now, it could well have been anything, but my brain was telling me this guy had a knife. I continued walking until I was around 100 meters away from the shortcut. Now I had a decision to make. Do I take the shortcut through the woods, or do I continue another half mile towards the main road, where there were likely cars? As I mentioned earlier, I spent a lot of time in those woods, and felt that I would at least have a chance to lose this guy in there. Looking back, and the guy was now around 200 meters behind me, and getting fast. My fight or flight kicked in, and I started sprinting towards the gate of the shortcut. Now the shortcut was a small unlit dirt road, wide enough for a car to fit down, with back gardens on one side, long grass on the other, and tree roots littering the path. As I rounded the gate onto the path, I checked back, and the man was fully sprinting behind me. I got about 10 meters down the path, and tripped on one of the roots, falling flat on my face. Part darkness, part alcohol is to blame, I would say. Knowing I had seconds to make a decision on what to do before he got to the gate. I didn't think I could get up and go quick enough. Plus my knee was shot after falling down. I did the first thing that came to my mind, and I rolled off the path and into the tall grass that lay there, trying to be as silent and still as possible. A moment later, I heard the gate rattle and someone walk up the path behind me. Unable to see, as I was laying on my front facing forward, I prayed that he did not spot me. The man lingered for a moment around 4 feet away from where I was laying, catching his breath. He was breathing really heavy, and I could tell he was straining his eyes to see, and see down the path in the dark. After what felt like eternity, he started walking off down the path, and I watched him go as far as I could see in the dark. My heart was beating fast, and the adrenaline was pumping through my body. I had sobered up very fast, and was now acutely aware of every single noise in the woods. I waited around 10 minutes after I last saw him before getting slowly to my feet. I very slowly made my way towards the road, listening carefully for any noises that were out of place in the woods, and keeping a low profile, moved back towards the gate. As I reached the gate, I heard a loud bang behind me. I spun around and saw a black cat had just jumped onto one of the fences. No sign of the man. I made my way onto the road and managed to get home without any further incident. Needless to say, I was incredibly wary whenever we returned to the woods for a drink. Potential knife-wielding murderer. Let's not meet. So a little background story. I am an athletic 19-year-old female. I was 18 when it happened. I live in a really small town with maybe less than 10,000 residents. And there are no streetlights where I live. Basically, everyone has an outside light on their front yards, and at night time they have to turn it on to provide lights for the street. And believe me, it doesn't light up that much. Anyways, it was around May of last year when it happened, and since I have a very hard time falling asleep, I used to go on nighttime joggings all the time between 1 and 3 a.m. It helped me fall asleep. My boyfriend and dad were always really concerned about that because it didn't sound safe for me to be jogging around the neighborhood super late at night, but like I said, I live in a really small town and I always thought nothing bad could happen to me until that night. So, it was a normal night. Kind of cold since I remember having my raincoat on. I tied my shoes and went on my almost daily nighttime jogging routine, I'd say. Probably around 1 or 2 a.m. I ran the same distance and took the same path, but for some reasons, I ran faster than usual and had to take a short walking break to catch my breath. I stopped in front of a park, a couple of streets away from my house, and started walking back toward my house, but that's when I noticed him. He was standing in the middle of the park, with a dog that looked like a husky or something, as big as that. Like I said before, there are no streetlights and no lights in the park either. Plus, the street I was on only had 2 houses, so they were not providing that much light, so I really could not tell if he was looking at me or even facing me at all. Obviously, it kind of shocked me to see someone wandering in a park so late at night, and I was not used to seeing people in the streets around those hours. But I shook it off and kept walking to head back home. But after a few steps ahead, I started to feel uneasy and weirded out. So I looked over my shoulder and I saw him, walking behind me, still holding his dog on leash. He was approximately 2 meters behind me. My heartbeat was already high from running, but I felt like it got even higher. I didn't feel safe at all, and even though I tried to keep calm, I just couldn't. So I started running as fast as I could, without even looking behind me, but to my horror, he started running too. I could hear his footsteps behind me. After what felt like ages of sprinting through different streets, I could not take it anymore as I was already exhausted from my jogging, so I turned into a driveway after taking a sharp turn into another street and hid. Crouched behind the bushes of the front yard. Not even 5 seconds later, I heard him take the turn and run past where I was hiding. Thank God. He then stopped running a few meters. I rationally thought he knew where I was, because my heart was beating so hard, I thought he could hear it. In front of where I was, I started looking everywhere, left, right, as if he was looking for someone. And then he finally turned around and I got to see him a little bit better. I definitely cannot tell how old he was, but considering he kept up with my running, he was probably less than 40, or just in really good shape. He was wearing all black, hoodie, pants, and a cap. His dog looked like a husky mixed with something else. He then turned back and started running again. I stayed behind the bush until I could not hear his footsteps anymore. God, I even stayed a good 10 minutes or more or so after that. I was so afraid I didn't want to come out, but I had to because I was still very vulnerable in the streets, and he could have came back any time. I then took all the courage and energy I had left, came out of where I was hiding, and started sprinting back in the opposite direction he had, to head back home, where I made it safely, and promised myself to never run late at night again. Never again. So, Creepy Park guy, let's never meet again. So this story happened back when I was in 5th grade in 2005. We lived in western Montana. My bedroom was shared with my 2nd grade sister, and we had a king-size bed that we shared. To describe my house a little, our room was facing the backyard, but was a basement room. Basically, standing up, looking out the window in my room, I was at eye level with the ground outside. Up and to the left above my window, I could see onto our deck, which looked into our upstairs kitchen. Kind of confusing, but bear with me. Anyways, this particular night, my sister and I were having a sleepover and our friend was in the bed with us. When we were falling asleep around 1 a.m., our friend woke us up to show us that a deer was on our deck. We looked out and we all saw a deer on the deck. This was normal in Montana, so we laid back down. I guess my friend stayed up staring at it, and she woke us up about 5 minutes later, saying she thought it was actually a person. Right then we looked and we saw the shadow move a little, and it was clearly a tall person's silhouette. We started freaking out, and then we saw 2 green laser lights. They were just 2 small pinpoint lights that were coming from the guy's head area. We all thought it was binoculars. At this point, we were on high alert, and our eyes had adjusted a little and we saw it was clearly a guy looking into our kitchen window. I was too scared to go tell my parents all the way upstairs and past the view of the guy looking in the window. So we used my friend's cell phone and called the home phone. None of us owned cells at the time. It rang loudly, and we watched the guy run full speed off the deck. As soon as he ran away, the 3 of us ran screaming upstairs and told my dad. He called the cops and they searched the streets, but never found the guy. Now here's where things get weird. Just 2 weeks earlier, the town's police station sent around notices in our neighborhood telling us that a person of interest and dangerous sexual predator who had a warrant for his arrest had been spotted in our area. A tip had said he was staying with a family member 3 streets down from us. I remember this because I remember my mom, who is a bit paranoid, drove us by the address of the house on the notice one time and made us very aware that this was going on and would not let us ride our bikes outside during this time. I remember looking at the house every time we drove by. Turns out, maybe 2 or 3 months later, this same man was apprehended for the kidnappings and abuse and murders of 2 children and killing their family in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, only 2-ish hours away from my house. In some of his interrogations, he confessed to stalking the kids by watching their homes at night with, what? Night vision goggles. The same green lights we saw that night. I also at one time found some obscure website that had some of his writings where he discussed living in Montana at various times, and discussed that right before killing this family, he was searching for children to kidnap. We were the same ages as the kids he kidnapped. Disclaimer: I have no proof that he was the person looking in our window, but the evidence all adds up for me, down to the timeline and area I lived in at the time. I won't go into the whole detail of his crimes. They are all over the news and you can read all about them. I've researched this guy in depth, and he was a sick motherfucker. He has alleged encrypted diaries of his crimes and filmed the tortures he committed. So I consider myself blessed. Hopefully he stays locked up so I never have to meet him. This took place in the winter of 2005 in rural Iowa. I was 18 years old and attending community college. I have always been an outgoing and talkative person, and managed in my youth to make friends quite easily. Carrie and I met when we were seated beside each other in math class we were both enrolled in. We weren't automatically friends, because she was a divorced single mom of 2 small boys, and she was in her late 20s. I was a teenager, just out of high school, still living with my grandparents. We just didn't have a lot in common on the surface, and she was usually quiet and just did her work. One day I had a bad case of the hiccups. I don't know how long I had been hiccuping for, but I distinctly remember grumbling and being pretty pissed off because 1, I fucking hate math, and 2, I fucking hate hiccups. I faintly realized that I was expressing my displeasure with my situation louder than I had thought when I felt Carrie's eyes on me. I looked up from my desk and said, what? She smiled and started asking me all kinds of questions about my hiccups. Did they hurt? Was it a sharp pain or dull? Was it pissing me off? What did it sound like? This whole time I'm answering her questions, thinking that she's fucking nuts. When her final question is posed, she says, "Can you hiccup one more time so I can hear it?" I tried, but my hiccups were gone. She was a damn genius. I started hanging out with Carrie more and more at school, and then we started going to her house to smoke bowls and cigarettes, until I finally get tired of her screaming kids or tired of watching her surf through her matches on dating sites all over the web. That was the thing about Carrie that I fucking hated. She was a member of almost every dating site available, as long as they were free. And she was constantly updating and changing these profiles. Her entire days were consumed with checking out matches or chatting with men on Yahoo Messenger. All of this seems innocent enough, but it didn't end with the internet. It started there. She would decide to meet these men sometimes, having them over to her place or going to their homes. She always slept with these creeps too, and while she occasionally dated the same guy twice or maybe 3 times, she was very clearly not seeking an actual relationship. While I was worried about Carrie's overly sexual behavior and ho-hum attitude, I didn't feel like it was my place to say anything to her. She seemed to understand that what she was doing was indeed risky, because one time she asked me to come over to her house because a guy was coming to pick her up, and she wasn't sure if he was who he said he was or not. I told her that I didn't know what the fuck I could do to help. I'm 5'0" and 125 pounds. But I went ahead and went over to her house to await the arrival of her newest love interest. Right on time, Mr. Internet shows up, and my friend leaves. Fast forward a couple of months, and Carrie found a new guy in a new town. I call him Louisiana in my head, because he claimed to be from the swamps somewhere outside New Orleans. Louisiana didn't have a vehicle, therefore was unable to visit. I guess the fact that she couldn't go out with him and fuck him made this man so much more appealing than the rest. She would literally not shut the fuck up about wanting to meet Louisiana. Apparently, he had told her that he lived in the biggest house in this small town about 2 hours, one way, from the town where we lived in. He supposedly had a large amount of money in stocks and bonds somewhere in New Orleans in a safety deposit box. He described his home as being a beautiful 3-story old Victorian, with 5+ bedrooms and 3 bathrooms. He also spoke in a cute Cajun accent. Louisiana is all she would talk about, and she was driving me fucking crazy. One day Carrie is all excited because Louisiana has finally saved up enough money to send her for gas. So she's planning a visit. I don't know why, but I didn't really feel right about her trip, and was very suspicious of this guy. I told Carrie about how I felt, but because I had no actual evidence of his creepiness, it was nothing more than a gut feeling. My gut was not getting in the way of her weekend with Louisiana. Apparently, I was not the only one who felt that this guy may be a creeper, and Carrie's Aunt Becky decided that she would be going with her niece to meet this too-good-to-be-true guy. I should mention that this savior aunt was only really 3 years older than Carrie, so while she was older than both of us, she was only 29 or 30 really, and a very heavy drinker. I look back and have absolutely no idea what the fuck possessed me to go with them to meet this man. Did I have a wish to end up dead in a ditch before my 19th birthday? I really don't know. But for some reason I decided to tag along with Carrie and Aunt Becky to meet a man that I was almost positive was a fucking creeper. I, of course, lied to my nanny and grandpa, telling them that I was staying the weekend just across town at Carrie's house. As I am typing this out, my face is flushed, my hands are shaking, and my heart is beating so hard, fast, that I feel like I may pass out. The events of this particular evening are fuzzy and broken. I have never said a word of this to anyone ever. Carrie, Becky, and I never spoke of it, and I moved to Texas just weeks after this happened. I have kept my mouth shut about this entire thing because I know that I was fucking stupid to go with them. The 2-hour drive seemed to go by in absolutely no time at all, and I was very obviously anxious about meeting this guy. Carrie and Becky both seemed unconcerned and passed around a joint and a bottle of some alcohol. I hit the joint, hoping to calm down a little before getting to Louisiana's Victorian mansion. I was immediately alarmed upon arriving at the mansion in question. Dilapidated old house was a more accurate description. The house had been painted white recently, and was 3 stories, so I decided not to judge the house by its street view. Louisiana had promised it was not a problem that Becky and I both decided to tag along, and had invited a friend of his own to stop by for a little while later that evening. He had told Carrie earlier that day that since he slept upstairs in the bedroom, we ladies would have the whole 2nd story to ourselves. When I saw the outside condition of the house, I felt another gut-wrenching feeling that something just wasn't right. I told my friends that I was too lazy to carry my own overnight bag inside, and that I would get it later. They shrugged it off as nothing, and Becky and I exchanged a quick, nervous glance before following a very excited Carrie. The front door was opened before we even reached the porch, and out stepped a short, doughy white guy with thinning hair. "Out of there, y'all little ladies. Must be my ladies' friends." I almost laughed out loud at this man's quite obviously fake Cajun accent, as Carrie had called it. I was born and raised most of my life in Texas, so I know a southern accent when I hear one, and this was a really bad one. More alarm bells in the pit of my stomach as I get a good look at Carrie seeing her lover boy for the first time. He was obviously aware of her staring, and why, because he immediately began apologizing for the older pictures he'd had to send her. He claimed that the pictures she was receiving from him were of him just from a few years ago. He waved us all inside, and even though he had lied about his mansion and his appearance, for some damned reason we all followed. So, there we were inside a strange house with a strange man, and I was positive that we were in trouble. I wasn't sure what the threat was yet, but I felt it, like acid eating away at my insides. Louisiana ushered us into the living room area and offered us a drink. He was very insistent that we have something, anything to drink. We all declined, but decided instead to smoke a bowl and let Carrie and Louisiana talk a little. I was listening to every single thing he said and kept looking at him, even though I never contributed to the conversation between him and my friend. I was listening to him describe his life, born and raised Southern gentleman, and wondering to myself if he had ever even visited a state below Missouri. He seemed to spew bullshit, but my friend was oblivious to the lies over everything as simple as the weather in the southern states to the pronunciation of a typical southern word. I decided to ask for a tour of the house, and he seemed to be irritated with me for asking, but when Carrie insisted, he reluctantly decided to give us a very quick tour. We saw the living room, kitchen, and one bathroom on the main floor, but all the other doors were locked. He led us up a short, narrow flight of stairs and showed us a quick peek through a doorway to what was supposed to be his room. I immediately felt like he was lying because there was dust over everything, but brushed it off as nothing. Maybe he hadn't slept in his bed for a while. Every single doorway minus one bathroom was nailed or painted shut. The tour was making me feel even more sick to my stomach. And I really started wanting to leave, but I didn't know how to tell Carrie and Becky without him hearing. He led us back downstairs and into the kitchen, where he had a big pot of beans on to boil. He ran to the stove and started ranting and raving about his Nan's gumbo recipe and demanded that we try it. I walked over to the pot and told him that it looked like beans to me because gumbo should have some sausage or something like that. At this point, Louisiana decides he doesn't like me very much, so he just started ignoring me. About an hour goes by and his friend shows up, looking all sorts of creepy. He doesn't introduce himself, or even make eye contact with any of us. He just walked in, sat down, and sparked up a joint. I was okay with that because boy was my anxiety through the roof. I could tell that Louisiana, Carrie, and Becky were all getting tired of my excessive questions. Sometime during that joint, Louisiana left the room to get us all some freshly squeezed lemonade. I remember him warning us that it could be bitter because he used real lemons and didn't like a lot of sugar. Halfway through my drink, I noticed the way he wasn't really engaging in conversation with us, ladies, anymore. He was watching us. No, watching me, like he was waiting for something. I felt like he was waiting for me to say or do something. It went from completely ignoring me to watching my every movement. I became extremely nervous with his gaze, so intense on the side of my face that I kicked Becky's foot and motioned towards him with a "The fuck is up with this guy" look. She saw exactly what I was talking about after a few more minutes of him just staring at me as Carrie rambled on about something. I suddenly decided that I had to get the fuck out of that house, and I jumped up out of my seat like I had been electrocuted. "Oh my god, sorry, but I left my bag outside. I'm going to go grab it." Carrie abruptly stopped talking because of my swift movement and scared tone of voice. She looked up at Louisiana, seeing his intense glaring in my direction, and as if truly seeing danger for the first time, she stood up and followed me towards the door. I quickly and quietly whispered to her that I had to leave. I told her that I wasn't feeling well and wanted to go home. I started out the door with Becky and Carrie following close behind. I will never forget walking away from that house and that man. I was terrified he was going to follow us. He was asking where we were going, and Becky threw him some lame answer about going to the convenience store and that we would be right back. I'm honestly not sure what it was that made both Carrie and Becky blindly follow me out of that house. Like I said before, he hadn't left us alone together, so I couldn't express my fears to them verbally. They had both seemed irritated with my excessively questioning him. I don't ever remember asking them why they believed me when I said I had to go. Maybe they both felt it too. His sinister stare as if trying to incinerate me with his eyes. We were almost 20 minutes away when whatever he had been waiting on took effect. I started hallucinating and felt oddly sedated. not connected to my body. My speech became slurred, and I drifted in and out of consciousness for the rest of the way home. Both girls assumed that I had simply passed out from exhaustion and had together carried me into her kid's bedroom. I woke often throughout the night, all in different stages of panic, but I couldn't manage to stay awake longer than a few minutes at a time. The next day I had a horrible headache, and my whole body felt like I had run a marathon. I woke up, wrote Carrie a goodbye note, got in my car and went home. I never spoke to Carrie or Becky again after this incident, and I hope to never see them again. I think of how much worse it could have been, and thank my lucky stars I'm not dead. So creepy online dude, let's not meet. Edit. After numerous inquiries about Carrie and her well-being, I decided once again to search for her. It's been approximately 5 years since I attempted to look her up, and I couldn't find a single reference for her. She is apparently divorced and gone back to her maiden name, so I was able to find her now that I'm searching for the correct person. She looks fine, just like her old Carrie self. Apparently she learned her lesson. It was a place where people cared about how their yards looked without guidelines set by HOA. Everyone knew their neighbors, everyone was neighborhood watch. Kids played in the street, and if there was a party, everyone came. Everyone watched out for everyone else. We called it the circle because that was the literal layout of the neighborhood. A giant circle. It was also a bubble. Even before the gates went up, the bad stayed out of the circle. It was almost like a parallel universe. Right at the edge of the circle were the liquor store and bail bonds, the drugs, pimps, and gangs. It is important to this story for you all to know that I am mixed race. My dad is black and my mom is white. They rented the lower half of a duplex owned by a pair of very nice people. Their daughter was my best friend growing up. Next door to the duplex was my grandparents' home where they lived with my 3 aunts and 3 uncles. It worked out perfectly because my Aunt S ran a daycare. When my mom walked out on us, my dad relied on my grandmother and Aunt S to watch me while he worked. It is important also to know that they are all black. I am on the opposite end of the spectrum when it comes to skin color. I am olive-skinned on the pale side. Anyone who didn't know us would have never guessed that I was a biological member of the family. My Aunt S frequented the liquor store just outside of the circle. It was where we walked when she needed cigarettes, and we kids bought dollar treats. It was small, it carried the basics that one might forget picking up from the grocery store. And we went there so often that everyone who worked there knew us. One day, I was the only kid my Aunt S was watching, and we walked together to the liquor store for her smokes. I can't stress enough that I do not look like her in any way. I was comfortable enough in the area that when we reached the path close to the liquor store, I ran off, still within sight of my aunt at all times. I entered the store before her, but only by about 30 seconds. I knew she wasn't going to get me treats, so while we went to the counter for her smokes, I decided to stroll through the aisles. Like I said, it's a small store with rows of goods. I like to snake up and down the aisles, going up one, down the next, up the next, etc. The very first aisle closest to the entrance was the dog food, toilet paper, travel-sized toothpaste aisle. There was this man standing there. I want to say he was looking at dog food, but I can't be sure. He was definitely shopping, though. I was either 7 or 8 at the time. It was the early 90s, so I was aware of stranger danger, and not talking to people I didn't know. So I didn't acknowledge him, aside from a quick glance before deciding to just breeze through the aisle instead of touching every little thing like I always do. In my head, when I picture him, I see a white man. A blurred but older face, not nursing home old, but maybe in his 50s, and I see his white hair. What stood out to me most, for whatever reason, was what he was wearing. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary. Khaki slacks and a brown leather jacket. Not worn leather, but the glossy kind. He glanced at me as well, but then went back to his shopping. Each aisle in the liquor store was about 15 feet. I'm horrible with math, so I'm guessing. My kitchen is 12 by 12 and the aisles were longer than that. And I slipped past the man and continued down the aisle towards the back of the store, where I planned to pivot and head back down the next aisle over. I don't remember actually seeing the moment he turned to follow me, but I remember feeling something, a shift in the atmosphere, or maybe a twist in my gut. But I just knew he was following behind me, not closely, but not coincidental, if you get what I mean. I don't know exactly what took over me. My dad says that back then, I didn't have enough common sense to find my way out of a paper bag. And I can't imagine having instincts honed enough to detect that kind of danger, and yet I felt something. Without really understanding why, I sped up as much as I could, without making it seem obvious. I made it to the end of the aisle. I pivoted and rounded the corner. It was at that moment when I realized I was right. He was behind me, and the moment I turned, he obviously sped up to close the gap. I didn't care at that point. I increased my speed, and in my peripheral I saw him lunge to close the gap more. That's when I took off and bolted to my aunt's side. She hadn't been paying attention to me during what was literally just over a minute from the time we walked in, but when I rushed up beside her at the counter, she took a quick look at me and then looked up and fixed that man with a stare that could freeze water. He turned and walked quickly out through the front entrance without buying a thing. In retrospect, I know exactly what that man was thinking when he saw a little white girl enter a liquor store by herself. He was thinking that it would be easy to say he's my grandfather, that I was kicking and hollering because he wouldn't buy me candy. He was thinking that it would be easy to walk me off to his car without question, because I looked like him and not the only other woman in the store. He judged a book by the cover and ended up dead wrong. I still think about this from time to time. What would have happened if I hadn't been so aware of him? What if he had succeeded? Where would I be? And probably the most heart-wrenching of all, were there others after me who hadn't been so lucky?